morning and welcome to this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee. We were delighted to be joined this morning by the Secretary of State for Wales, the Right Honourable David T.C. Davis, formerly Chairman of this committee. We're also joined by Dr James Davis MP, who's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Wales Office. Thank you very much for giving us your time. Can I perhaps start by asking about relations with Welsh Government? When Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister last autumn, I think it was within the first day that he reached out to the First Ministers of the devolved administrations with phone calls. Has he continued to do that? Was he starting as he meant to go on? What's been the ongoing contact and dialogue between the Prime Minister and the First Minister of Wales in the intervening months?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to come along and give evidence today. To answer that directly, I don't know exactly how often the Prime Minister and the First Minister speak to each other, but I have the First Minister's number, he has mine. We can speak at any time. I think the last time I met him was probably when we opened the free port, so I think I've spoken to him on online meetings, I think, since then. I meet regularly with ministers in the Welsh Government, and most generally speaking, the Economic Development Minister, Mr Vaughan Gethin. So what I found is that we have actually a very good professional working relationship.
The reason I'm asking those questions is, as a committee, we've sometimes, I think, struggled to really kind of get a clear picture of how relations between the centre, if you like, within UK government and the devolved nations, how those are being conducted and what that looks like on a kind of week-to-week basis. So that's the reason for asking about those. Since you last appeared before us, there's been obviously the successful announcement about the 2 free ports in Wales. Certainly from my part, I thought it was a very successful and welcome announcement between UK government and Welsh government. Are there any other kind of projects that you're currently working on in a kind of similarly pragmatic way with Welsh Government, and what would be the areas that you would point to show that there is this joint working?
I think my colleague was trying to get in on that last question. I don't know whether you want to...
I just wanted to highlight the existence of the interministerial group meetings, which do take place regularly, and I find those very helpful in terms of communication. There are countless also informal meetings that Welsh ministers have kindly engaged with, a lot of correspondence, and also liaison, of course, with local authority leaders too, the tier below, which is increasingly important for UK government.
Okay, yeah. That's helpful. The problems like have been encountered in relation to Betsy Cadwallader. I mean, is there any contact that goes on, if you're aware of, between Welsh health boards or Welsh government and health authorities in England? Is there any kind of sharing of expertise and assistance, or is it your understanding that the Welsh health system is entirely separate and basically there's very, very little that can be done from a UK government perspective on these?
To that.
I mean, there are limited areas that are reserved in terms of health, as you'll be aware, Chairman, relating to embryology and drug supply, for instance. Clinical guidelines often are done at the UK level. NICE, of course, provides advice that applies to Wales. Whether it then gets audited on a UK-wide basis is another matter, and that's a concern I often have. And then at the local level, of course, you have agreements, cross-border agreements with tertiary care centres. You've also got examples of Welsh Government engaging with health provision in England in respect of the electronic prescription rollout, which is due to try and emulate that, which is something that could have been done 15 years ago, in my view.
Don't want to spend too long on policing, but does the police minister ever visit Wales?
I'm sorry?
Does the police minister ever visit Wales?
I would imagine so. I believe there was a visit quite recently, but I'm not 100% certain off the top of my head. So
South Wales, yeah.
It was it?
If it's a reserved issue to UK government, do you feel that the UK government gives policing in Wales enough attention?
And the Uplift programme, of course, has been more than met in Wales, hasn't it? So that's a big success story.
This is the additional police officer that were to be recruited.
That's right.
Okay, so that's been fully met in Wales, has it?
It has.
Yes.
onto connectivity. Holyhead is the second busiest road port in the UK, and we had the Union Connectivity Review by Sir Peter Hendy, who said one of his concerns was this port capacity in Holyhead and the connections from Ynys and North Wales to Merseyside and Manchester for freight and passengers. We've had the sudden closure of the Menai Suspension Bridge in October last year, and we've got the Britannia Bridge occasionally closes under high winds. In terms of the Welsh Government, in February the crossing was axed as part of the Welsh Government's roads review, and the First Minister said in March that the third crossing is off the table due to the loss of Wilver. And last week we had Lee Waters, the Deputy Minister for Climate Change, stated that the Welsh Government did not have the 400 million needed for a third crossing. How do you, as Secretary of State, see that we can actually invest in access to Holyhead, which is one of our critical ports in the UK?
Well, I think we should be making that an absolute priority, especially given the Freeport decision, which Port Holyhead are very, very pleased with, and told me that they had potential investors coming in the following day, the day after that announcement. So that's the first thing. So I would, I would suggest the Welsh Government need to think very carefully about their ban on new road building. They need to think about a third Menai Bridge crossing and look at the A55. And I will continue to press UK Government over the importance of taking forward the business case proposals for the North Wales coastline because of the obvious benefits that will bring to Welsh passengers and businesses, especially when HS2 is finished and people from North Wales will have much easier access to London via the Crewe interchange.
We had 20 million investment for the Holyhead breakwater was announced in the budget recently by the Chancellor. Now, of course, that is a devolved issue to Welsh Government, yet the UK Government stepped in to actually provide that investment because it is absolutely critical if we're to get investment in Holyhead and in North Wales that we actually we protect the port there. So are we looking at the UK Government coming in to actually invest in a third crossing?
Well, obviously any third crossing would require planning support and would require, whoever paid for it, would require Welsh Government to change their view about the ban on new road building.
I think it is worth also saying that UK Government has shown its commitment to the strategic road network in Wales by means of the Union Connectivity Review and the attached development funding. There's a pot for devolved transport of, I think, £23 million, which Welsh Government can access to develop feasibility studies to look at key improvements such as the ones you mentioned. And it's also important to mention that we await the North Wales Transport Commission findings later this year, and hopefully they will recognise your calls.
The 23 million funding pot, what have they accessed that for? Which projects have they accessed that for?
I don't believe that is in the public domain, and it's an ongoing pot that is available, and it is for Welsh Government to bid to it, and so that's something for local authorities, for politicians to raise with Welsh Government.
Thank you.
You recognise this, presumably?
I'm having, my eyes are going.
I
Yes,
shall
that's a
help you
picture
out.
of Mr.
This is
Johnson.
the manifesto from 2019.
Yes.
Upon which we both stood, knocked on doors, promised the people. Okay. I refer you to page 47. To support our union, we will upgrade the A55, increasing its capacity and resilience to build connections between Wales and the rest of the United Kingdom. ITV Wales' Adrian Masters happens to be with us today. Interviewed Boris Johnson in 2021, so 2 years after it was necessary to make a promise, who said, I quote, "We're looking at a number of projects, including the M4 and the A55 and North Wales corridor. Any time I ask the Department for Transport, they say, nothing to do with us. It's in the manifesto." The Prime Minister confirmed it was in the plans 2 years after the election. When are you going to do it?
I think it's fair to say that when that was written, the Welsh Government itself was funding studies into multiple improvements along the A55. I mean, they're listed, aren't they?
Sure.
They've been put on ice and they're various stages of completion. And clearly this government has shown its commitment to upgrade strategic routes through the Union Connectivity Review, and the pot of funding I referred to before, which I must correct, actually it was 20 million, not 23 for the devolved element, and then there was another pot for the reserved element. So UK government has shown its commitment to Union connectivity and upgrade of the key strategic routes, but it does need Welsh Government to engage with it to deliver on that.
But just in terms of moving on to another aspect, and I'm interested to hear about your relations with other departments of government, and with a particular interest in how the Wales Office can influence policies. I don't mean to open a debate about trade agreements, but one of the things that you might have become aware of in recent times is that there are concerns, particularly among farmers, that supermarkets, particularly with online retailing, are no longer giving consumers the option of specifying whether they'd like to buy British meat or meat from overseas. And I know, Secretary of State, that you'll appreciate the sensitivities on that matter. Is it something that the Wales Office could go to perhaps DEFRA and lobby and say, look, we need to be a little bit stricter here?
Absolutely. I mean, that is something I would be very happy to talk to DEFRA about. I mean, to answer the general part of your question is we have a very good relationship with other government departments, and I have frequent meetings with other government ministers and cabinet ministers, and I'd be happy to send a list over, because it's almost sort of so regular that I can't I couldn't tell you after I couldn't start giving you numbers, but if we want meetings, we get meetings.
Do you think that there has been a change in the makeup and the availability of food and drink from this country in your experience in the supermarkets? And there is, of course, the tractor mark, isn't there, that is used frequently with pride. There's also the designated origin labelling that the government has been pushing to help specific types of food relating to areas. I mean, in my experience, often labelling is relatively good, and increasingly consumers have wanted to know where their food is from.
I would agree with you, Minister. The issue, of course, is with online shopping in particular, which is growing in popularity. There is no longer that choice to choose. And the supermarkets, when I've challenged them on this, would suggest that, well, it is, of course, possible for the consumer on the doorstep to send the meat back. Which is rather ridiculous position to hold. And I think you are right. When if a physical supermarket, there are stricter kind of guidelines in terms of prominence and labelling. And of course, the consumer has the choice. But it's something that I'd be interested if the Wales Office, because it applies to producers across the UK, but of course, particular sensitivities in Wales. And I think the Wales Office would be in a good place to perhaps champion. Just on the matter of shared prosperity funding, very briefly, we've held a couple of sessions now with representatives from universities in Wales. Do you think we need to be realistic?
Yes.
And the so-called golden triangle of institutions, they've had, dare I say it, centuries of head start on many of our own institutions in Wales. They have been far more successful over the years in attracting a lot of private investment, and I declare interest as an alumnus of one of those institutions. It was quite striking when I was looking at, they have my own college, one college within University of Oxford has a greater endowment than all of the universities in Wales put together. Their income per student is nearly £500,000. The next best sort of equivalent in Wales is the University of Cardiff, which I think is about £30,000 per student a year. Do you think that it is fair and sustainable? And also, does it align with the government's stated ambition of levelling up areas, that we expect all of these institutions across the UK to compete on the same level for the same amount of money?
I mean, I think it's important to consider that universities elsewhere in the UK haven't been dependent on EU structural funds, partly because they often weren't there. They weren't eligible for it. So it's a transition in many respects towards UKRI funding that we probably need to see. And there is an existing commitment by the government to increase R&D funding outside of the greater southeast of the UK by 40% by 2030. So that is there to be taken, and it's a question of making the case for Welsh universities.
Well, thank you.